Of course, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is central to the Christian faith. But can we really know that Jesus lived, that he died on the cross, that he was buried, and he was raised from the dead? As we try to make an argument for the historicity of Jesus, what kind of documents can we use to make, again, a case for the historical Jesus?
Well, I think the first document you can use is the New Testament, because we always have to remember that the New Testament is not just one document, it's a collection of 27 documents. And if you follow a kind of evidentialist model of apologetics, as we were discussing in a previous series, the 27 documents that make up the New Testament can be assumed at the outset as just a collection of human documents which come down to us from the first century. And as you begin your search for truth and search for who Jesus was, you will simply treat those 27 documents as of varying degrees of reliability, just like you would any other historical document. So that would be one document that I would use, or one collection of documents that I would use. The early church fathers are essential in establishing certain claims about who Jesus was. The Jewish Talmud discusses Jesus. We also have other historians like Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius who talk about a man named Jesus who lived and died under the orders of Pontius Pilate. So I think we have a plethora of sources that the historian can use to reconstruct a life of Jesus and even determine whether Jesus did and said what the New Testament says he did and said.
Now, this is a little bit surprising to me because I'm not a historian, I'm a biochemist, but I was always under the impression that I would never want to use the Bible and the New Testament specifically to make a case for the historical Jesus, that I would want to rely on these non-biblical sources. And so you're saying that the Bible is perfectly acceptable as, again, a collection of source documents to defend Jesus' existence.
Yes, the average ancient historian, the average New Testament scholar is very comfortable going in to the New Testament documents and sifting through them to find out what is true and what is not well evidenced and so forth. And the reason this is not arguing in a circle, as some people claim, is because what New Testament historians are doing is they're taking certain criteria of authenticity, like the criterion of multiple attestation, which is one of the most important ones, and they're applying that to the New Testament documents. If you find a statement of Jesus, or you find an event in the life of Jesus that is attested in more than one source, then it's highly probable that that event happened. So just take the crucifixion as just one example. It's multiply attested. It's attested in the New Testament, the Gospels. It's attested in Paul. It's attested in Tacitus. It's attested in Josephus. So we have at least 4 sources that we can appeal to show, yeah, Jesus really was crucified. And for that matter, those 4 sources also are attesting, are they not, that Jesus really did exist. Also, when you look at the New Testament, you'll notice that it has the marks of eyewitness testimony. And the most important eyewitness testimony we have from the New Testament would be the writings of Paul. Paul's epistles are the earliest documents we have in Christian history, describing what was going on in the early church and what Christians believed. And there are no New Testament scholars out there who will deny that that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians and Galatians and Romans. And so if I can just take the book of Galatians as an example, if you go into Galatians chapter 1 and read through just that one chapter, you'll find Paul giving the story of his own conversion from Judaism to Christianity, how the God who had set him apart before he was even born revealed himself in Paul. And then Paul, 3 years after his conversion, goes to Jerusalem and rubs shoulders with Peter, who was the chief disciple of Jesus, and James, who was the brother of Jesus. Now, it's very hard to have a brother or chief disciple if you don't exist. And this is why the vast majority of New Testament critics and historians will say there was a man named Jesus, and this Jesus had disciples. And Paul conversed with these disciples soon after his conversion.
Now, what about the church fathers? I mean, how would you justify utilizing their writings, again, as historical documents to make the case for the Christian faith?
Well, showing that there's a continuity between what's going on in the first century and then what's going on in the second century is a very important point to make. One reason we believe that the New Testament documents are first century documents is because they aren't dealing with issues that we find the church dealing with in the second century. And so we can find a kind of discontinuity between the concerns of the second century and the concerns of the first century. So the church fathers are very helpful there. Also, it's very interesting that the church fathers are quoting the New Testament often in their writings. And so if there's any doubt as to the authenticity of a certain text, say for example, questions have been raised about whether 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 11 really were written by Paul. One of the reasons why that question has been raised is because what Paul does in 1 Corinthians 15 is he lays out a series of witnesses, people who actually observed Jesus after he had risen from the dead. Now, if Paul is writing this, and he's writing this very early in church history, it's very hard to avoid the idea that maybe the resurrection really is well evidenced. And so some people have tried to argue that 1 Corinthians 15 wasn't authored by Paul. Well, one of the reasons why most textual critics believe that it was authored by Paul is because it's quoted in the early church fathers. Ignatius, for example, quotes those very verses coming from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 11, in his travels and in his writings. And so in his epistle to the Romans, he quotes those verses, and Ignatius lived very early in the second century. And that gives us a lot of confidence that Paul really did write this stuff. So the early church fathers are very essential in establishing various things like textual criticism, the authenticity of certain documents, and the continuity in Christian belief.